Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to start with our third series in the seminar series on business of dentistry. The first, and she's not even here. The first time we met, there was a member of the group that said, "Oh, we're going to be talking about leases, right?" And I said, "Sure, we can talk about leases." So what I did is I reached back into the archives. And I brought somebody out of retirement just for you guys. All right, so Louis Gelmon and his wife Susie in the back. They came to Vegas just for this and also to see a few shows. But he helped me with my lease three years ago. And got me a killer deal. Over the 10-year lease that I have with my landlord, I think the savings we calculated out about $250,000. Plus, we put in all the right little dealios that you need to have in your lease when you go out and sign for your either your building or your build out or your office suite to make sure that you can be free and clear if something should happen to you. Now, for you in attendance, if you are a business owner and you are in a lease right now, Louis will do the analysis for free, which is a $1,495 value. So if you have that, I'm sure he'll pop up his contact information, or not, I can get it to you, and he'd be happy to do this. So Louis Gelmon is a lease negotiator. I feel like there should be like some sort like big, pull out a badge or something like that, lease negotiator. But what he does is he will work for you with your landlord to make sure you have the best lease. Now he's a big foodie guy. He did a lot of those pad leases for Burger King in the West Coast, and so he knows what he speaks. And he'll answer your questions. He'll go through his presentation. Please, it's interactive. We want you to know what's going on, and I'm sure he'll entertain your questions at the end. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Louis.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming. We're going to take a look at a few key things that I'd like you to leave here with tonight. One is a different mindset. Break the traditional dental thinking mindset when it comes to dealing with landlords and when it comes time to set up your commercial leases or to deal with a lease renewal, depending on what your situation is going to be. We're going to get you thinking more like a landlord and get you thinking more like a tenant that has a costly physical plant than like a dentist. I think you'll enjoy that. We're going to go over the knowledge, or what I call the good leasing guidelines for dentistry. So there's a few key things that before you sign a lease, or if you're in a lease already, when it comes time to renew, you want to make sure that that lease follows the good leasing guidelines for dentistry. Really 5 key things which we're going to go through tonight. And then, of course, an action plan. Maybe just a show of hands, how many people here are going to be looking to open up a practice, say, in the next 5 years? And how many people here are in a practice already that they've got an existing lease? So just one, okay. So we're going to talk more about getting the leases set up correctly so that you can avoid a lot of the problems as your career progresses. Ordinarily, when I've given this presentation over the years, I've been speaking to your colleagues who are closer to retirement. And the problems that these guys have in their leases have been in their leases since the day they originally signed first with their landlords when they started their practice sometimes 20 or 30 years ago. And so if you can preempt those problems, and if you can create a lease agreement that's designed properly for a dental office right out of the gate, that's going to save yourself a lot of headaches down the road. And a lot of people build these practices to create long-term value so that when it is time to retire, they can sail comfortably into the sunset. And one of the things that I have written about extensively is when you sell your practice, you are in fact selling your commercial lease agreement more than anything. If that lease agreement isn't done correctly, you're going to have a hard time selling your practice, or at the very least, you're going to have a hard time selling your practice for the most value that you think it's worth. So we'll cover off why that is tonight. The outline for our discussion is going to talk about understanding the tenant lease cycle. So for those of you who are going to be looking to open up a practice in the next few years, this is a really key, important part of the evening for you, because setting up that lease and understanding when you should be going into getting your building permits, when you should be starting construction, when you should be getting free rents from the landlord, so on and so forth, should follow a particular time frame that often is overlooked and missed because the people who are setting you up in these practices, namely the real estate brokers that I'm not big fans of, tend to push you guys along too quickly and get you signing documents that you shouldn't be signing, and even paying rent before you have your building permits in place. So we'll talk about these sorts of things tonight. We'll then get into identifying the risks in your lease, and we'll talk about the key things that you want to avoid and where you gain the good leasing guidelines for dentistry, which we're going to talk about here. I don't think we'll do a stretch and coffee. You want me out of here in 45 minutes, so I'll do my best for that. And then we'll talk about the renewal process. Probably not too much because you're the only one that's going to have a renewal coming up. And oh, okay. So we'll talk a little bit about that, but mostly we'll focus in on the risks and the tenant lease cycle and getting into the lease. Again, feel free to stop me, ask questions throughout. It is an interactive discussion. I'll probably prompt you on some of the questions tonight as we go. Now, this is a pie chart that I pulled out of a textbook when I was a landlord lease negotiator. In my previous life, before a previous life, I used to manage shopping centers, and I learned how to manage shopping centers and negotiate leases through what's called, not unlike the Dental Society here in the U.S., it's called the International Council of Shopping Centers, and that's where most landlords take their training. They learn how to negotiate leases, and they look at this chart and they study it quite carefully, and what they're looking at is trying to identify when they have the most leverage when it comes time to renegotiate a lease with their tenants. And one of the things that we have to understand as commercial tenants is, when do landlords want to open up renegotiations with you? And that is important out of the gate when you open up, or when you first open up your practice, because you've got to set the dates up carefully in the lease, understand when they fall down the road, because that's when you're going to gain the most value for you. So the landlords are thinking about when your leases expire or close to expiry right out of the gate. You guys need to be doing that as well. You'll see why that is over the course of our discussion. But if I were to ask people, and just to get a show of hands, when do most people think that their lease should be renewed, or when they should open up negotiations with their landlord to start to renegotiate their lease? Doctor, you've got one coming up. When would you best think? About a year in advance? That's right, a year and a half to 2 years. A lot of tenants, if I were to survey dentists right across the board, would probably think about 6 months prior to term expiry. And the reason why it gets redder closer to term expiry is because that's when the landlords have you in a maximum position to be able to negotiate lease renewals with their original tenants. And the problem that I have always found with this tenant lease cycle is that a lot of tenants can't correctly identify where they're at in that lease cycle. They don't know when their lease terms commence. They don't know when their lease term expires. And if you don't know when your lease term expires, you're not going to be able to correctly identify when you have certain key rights in your lease, like when the last day is to exercise an option to further extend or renew, or when you should be opening up renewal negotiations with the landlord. And so the first thing that we have to talk about is the key dates that lead into a lease before the lease term actually starts. So if I were to ask tenants, especially in the dental community, well, when did your lease term commence? A lot of people will think of it, oh, well, when I signed the lease agreement. Well, that's not correct. Or, well, I'll go back to my lease agreement and I'll take a look at what's on the first page where all the key dates are, and then we'll say, well, hang on a second. Were those dates further amended? So the dates on the lease agreement that you first sign are often dates that are estimates only. When you and the landlord originally thought you would be getting your practice open to the general public. And the problem with that is sometimes there's delays, there's construction delays, there's permitting delays, and ultimately what ends up happening is you look at those key dates that are on the first page of the lease, but shortly after you got your lease commenced, when you started practicing to the general public, the landlord will have sent you off a letter changing the term commencement date so that it correctly reflects what actually happened rather than the estimate. That letter goes missing over the course of a long-term tenancy. You forget about it, and before you know it, you are incorrectly identifying the dates on your lease agreement. The first date that you've got to be familiar with is, when did the lease actually commence? When was the term commencement? And the term commencement date, or when the clock starts ticking on this tenant lease cycle, is actually a culmination of dates. The landlord will give you the lease, you'll sign it. That is not the term commencement date. The term commencement date is preceded by what is usually referred to in the industry as a fixturing period. That fixturing period is that time frame where you are in possession of the premises. So you have the keys to the premises, where you are installing your equipment, you're building out your leaseholds, and that is typically between, and this is a negotiated time frame between you and your landlord, anywhere from 30 days in length to as much as 120 days in length. It's important to have the right length of time so you can do your build-outs. Building out a dental office takes months. Before you build out the dental office, you have to get your building permits. In some jurisdictions, the building permits can take months to get. So you don't want to be taking possession to start the fixturing period until you have your building permits in hand. Once your building permits are in hand, the landlord can then turn over the keys to the premises and you can start the fixturing period. That'll take you through 120 days when you're under construction. That time frame should be all rents free. You shouldn't have to pay the landlord any free rent or any base rent, and you shouldn't have to pay the landlord any additional rents like utilities or operating costs or common area maintenance charges. The expiration of that fixturing period, which is going to be the earlier of the day you open for business, or the last day that you and the landlord agreed that you could be doing your build-outs during that period, becomes your actual term commencement. That's why it's so difficult to figure out when your lease starts, because it can be adjusted based on a few different activities or events that happen. And if you can't correctly identify when your lease term commences, you're not going to be able to correctly identify when your lease term expires. And if you don't know when your lease term expires, you're going to miss another key date, which is the last day when you can exercise any further options to extend. And the reason why understanding when the last day to exercise options to extend are is because most dentists tend not to relocate more than once over the course of their careers. These are long-term engagements or long-term arrangements. And a lot of these leases are 5 years in length, followed by maybe 2 or 3 5-year renewal options. So it's important to understand when you have those rights, when they're available to you, and so you can identify correctly when to open up those negotiations. I've covered off a lot of knowledge very quickly. I'll stop there for a minute and see if there's any questions, so you guys got this. All good? So again, I want to emphasize one key point here, is you want to make sure that you're not taking possession of the premises in that free rent period or the fixturing period until you have your building permits. And if the landlord says, well, if your fixturing period is 90 days, you get your building permit in that 90 days, The net free rent period, which is an inducement that the landlords will give you to sign the lease, should only start, if they're giving you one, after the lease term commences and you're open to the general public. That's when the free rent period should start. The fixturing period is an entirely different matter. A lot of landlords will say, well, we'll give you 3 months free rent so you can do your construction. That's not what I'm talking about here. Fixturing period is all rents free. That's classic, typical in the industry. That's usually followed by a free rent period after the term commences. Okay, enough said. Thank you for your attention on that. So we took a look at the term commencement, the possession date, and the fixturing period. We talked about the last day which you can exercise your option to renew or extend, which typically falls anywhere from 90 days prior to the end of term to 6 months prior to the end of term. Have to be careful how these lease agreements read. Sometimes the landlords will put some tricky dates. They'll say you can exercise your option between 90 and 120 days prior to term expiry, which gives you a very narrow window in which you can exercise an option to further extend. We'll talk more about that in just a minute. Okay, first risk I want to take a look at is this option to renew. Then we'll move into some of these other ones. This option to renew is a typically worded option to renew. And again, the reason why I start my discussion here on these options to renew is because these are one of the most key and important provisions you as dentists are going to have to sign. And the reason why that is it's because you guys, like a lot of other typical tenants that have costly physical plants, can't easily pick up and move. When you build out that dental practice, you're going to be paying hundreds of dollars a square foot to build it out. You're going to be building your business based on that physical location and that premises. You want to have to avoid having to relocate. If you don't get this component of your commercial lease done correctly, the likelihood of having to move or relocate goes up quite a bit, which is going to end up costing you lots of money. So what I would like to do as an example with how complex some of these provisions could be is I would like you to have a read through this. I'll stop talking so you can do it for a couple of minutes. As you read through it, see if you can pick out the key risks that are in here, where if this was going into your lease agreement, you would say, hey, wait a minute, there's a problem here. I should stop and think. I'll let you do that for a couple of minutes, and then we will pick it up from there. All right, what are some of the problems that you see with this? Yes, doctor. Right. So you're correct. So the 9 month